The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 30, Glamis Castle. One of our ancient castles that has long had a reputation for the hauntings and the apparitions that trouble it is Glamis or Glamis Castle in Forfarshire, the seat of Lord Strathmore. Although the whole pile of buildings appears to suffer under the ban, there is one particular chamber which is especially known as the haunted room. Access to this ominous chamber is said to be now cut off by a stone wall, and none are supposed to be acquainted with its locality, save Lord Strathmore, his heir, and the factor of the estate. This wall is alleged to have been erected some few years ago by order of the late proprietor, in consequence of certain mysterious sights and sounds which he had both seen and heard. There is no doubt, writes a correspondent of Dr. Lee, about the reality of the noises at Glamis Castle. On one occasion, some years ago, the head of the family, with several companions, was determined to investigate the cause. One night, when the disturbance was greater and more violent and alarming than usual, and, it should be premised, strange, weird, and unearthly sounds had often been heard, and by many persons, some quite unacquainted with the ill repute of the castle, his lordship went to the haunted room, opened the door with a key, and dropped back in a dead swoon into the arms of his companions, nor could he ever be induced to open his lips on the subject afterwards. A well-known antiquary furnishes the following local legend connected with the old stronghold to account for the sights and noises heard about it. He states that the tradition is that in olden time, during one of the constant feuds between the Lindsays and the Ogilvies, a number of the latter clan, flying from their enemies, came to Glamis Castle and begged hospitality of the owner. He did not like to deny them the shelter of his castle walls, and therefore admitted them, but on the plea of hiding them, so it is averred, he secured them all in a large out-of-the-way chamber, that afterwards known as the Haunted One, and there left them to starve. Their bones lie there till this day, according to the common tradition, their bodies never having been removed. It has been suggested that it was the sight of these which so startled the late Lord Strathmore on entering the room, and which caused him subsequently to have it walled up. The scene is believed to have been particularly horrifying, some of the unfortunate captives having died apparently in the act of gnawing the flesh from their arms. Thus much for the tradition that accounts for the weird disturbances which, if Dr. Lee's correspondent may be credited, were still in a state of activity not very long ago. Among other strange instances, the writer states that on one occasion a lady and her child were staying for a few days at the castle. The child was asleep in an adjoining dressing room, and the lady, having gone to bed, lay awake for a while. Suddenly, a cold blast stole into the room, extinguishing the nightlight by her bedside, but not affecting the one in the dressing room beyond, in which her child had its cot. By that light, she saw a tall, mailed figure pass into the dressing room from that in which she was lying. Immediately thereafter, there was a shriek from the child. Her maternal instinct was aroused. She rushed into the dressing room and found the child in an agony of fear. It described what it had seen as a giant who came and leant over its face. We are unable to learn when this disturbing apparition appeared, but it is to be hoped not since Lord Strathmore had the haunted room walled up, that it is most devoutly to be hoped shut in all unpleasant sights, even if it could not quite suppress the sounds. Section 31, Glasgow, the Hell Club. There is a somewhat well-known story of an extremely startling character related by Mrs. Crowe under the title of The Glasgow Hell Club, in that chapter of the Night Side of Nature, styled The Future That Awaits Us. The story, notwithstanding its sensationalism, is declared to be a relation of facts, of which a contemporary account was published, but was bought up by the family of the chief actor in the drama. As usual in such cases, a few copies escaped destruction, and the narrative was reprinted and widely diffused. Mrs. Crowe's version of this undoubted and well-attested fact is as follows. Some 90 years ago, there flourished in Glasgow a club of young men, which, from the extreme profligacy of its members and the licentiousness of their orgies, was commonly called the Hell Club. Besides these nightly or weekly meetings, they held one grand annual Saturnalia, in which each tried to excel the other in drunkenness and blasphemy. And on these occasions, there was no star amongst them whose lurid light was more conspicuous than that of young Mr. Archibald B., who, endowed with brilliant talents and a handsome person, had held out great promise in his boyhood, and raised hopes which had been completely frustrated by his subsequent reckless dissipations. One morning, after returning from this annual festival, Mr. Archibald B., having retired to bed, dreamt the following dream. He fancied that he himself was mounted on a favorite black horse that he always rode, and that he was proceeding towards his own house, then a country seat embowered by trees and situated upon a hill, now entirely built over and forming part of the city, when a stranger, whom the darkness of night prevented his distinctly discerning, suddenly seized his horse's reins, saying, "You must go with me." "And who are you?" exclaimed the young man, with a volley of oaths, whilst he struggled to free himself. "That you will see by and by," returned the other, in a tone that excited unaccountable terror in the youth, who, plunging his spurs into his horse, attempted to fly, but in vain. However fast the animal flew, the stranger was still beside him, till at length, in his desperate efforts to escape, the rider was thrown. But instead of being dashed to the earth, as he expected, he found himself falling still, as if sinking into the bowels of the earth. At length, a period being put to this mysterious descent, he found breath to inquire of his companion, who was still beside him, whither they were going. "Where am I? Where are you taking me?" he exclaimed. "To hell," replied the stranger, and immediately interminable echoes repeated the fearful sound, "To hell, to hell, to hell." At length a light appeared, which soon increased to a blaze. But instead of the cries and groans and lamentings the terrified traveler expected, nothing met his ear but sounds of music, mirth, and jollity, and he found himself at the entrance of a superb building, far exceeding any he had seen constructed by human hands. Within, too, what a scene! No amusement, employment, or pursuit of man on earth but was here being carried on with a vehemence that excited his unutterable amazement. There the young and lovely still swam through the mazes of the giddy dance. There the panting steed still bore his brutal rider through the excitement of the goaded race. There, over the midnight bowl, the intemperate still drawled out the wanton song or maudlin blasphemy. The gambler plied forever his endless game, and the slaves of Mammon toiled through eternity their bitter task, whilst all the magnificence of earth paled before that which now met his view. He soon perceived that he was amongst old acquaintances, whom he knew to be dead, and each, he observed, was pursuing the object, whatever it was, that had formerly engrossed him. When, finding himself relieved of the presence of his unwelcome conductor, he ventured to address his former friend, Mrs. D., whom he saw sitting, as had been her wont on earth, absorbed at loo, requesting her to rest from the game and introduce him to the pleasures of the place, which had appeared to him to be very unlike what he had expected, and indeed an extremely agreeable one. But with a cry of agony she answered that there was no rest in hell, that they must ever toil on at those very pleasures, and innumerable voices echoed through the interminable vaults, "There is no rest in hell," whilst throwing open their vest, each disclosed in his bosom an ever-burning flame. These, they said, were the pleasures of hell. Their choice on earth was now their inevitable doom. In the midst of the horror this scene inspired, his conductor returned, and at his earnest entreaty restored him again to earth. But as he quitted him, he said, "Remember, in a year and a day we meet again." At this crisis of his dream, the sleeper awoke, feverish and ill, and whether from the effects of the dream or of his preceding orgies, he was so unwell as to be obliged to keep his bed for several days, during which period he had time for many serious reflections, which terminated in a resolution to abandon the club and his licentious companions altogether. He was no sooner well, however, than they flocked around him, bent on recovering so valuable a member of their society, and having wrung from him a confession of the cause of his defection, which, as may be supposed, appeared to them eminently ridiculous, they soon contrived to make him ashamed of his good resolutions. He joined them again, resumed his former course of life, and when the annual Saturnalia came round, he found himself with his glass in his hand at the table, when the president, rising to make the accustomed speech, began by saying, "Gentlemen, this being leap year, it is a year and a day since our last anniversary," etc., etc. The words struck upon the young man's ear like a knell, but, ashamed to expose his weakness to the jeers of his companions, he sat out the feast, plying himself with wine even more liberally than usually, in order to drown his intrusive thoughts, till, in the gloom of a winter's morning, he mounted his horse to ride home. Some hours afterwards, the horse was found with his saddle and bridle on, quietly grazing by the roadside, about halfway between the city and Mr. B.'s house. whilst a few yards off lay the corpse of his master. Comment on this weird tale is needless on our part, unless it be to remark that it would point a moral in a far more emphatic manner were the real names given of the young man whose fate is supposed to be described. Section 32, Greyrig Hall. In Duchetiana, it is stated by Sir G. B. Ducat that not a vestige remains of those extensive foundations which, 100 years ago, attested the solidity and importance of the Westmoreland Ducat's residence, the Manor House, known formerly as Greyrig Hall. A strange story is told of the last member of this opulent family who inhabited this fine old English mansion ere it was dismantled. The narrative has been detailed with great similarity in various works, such as Ferguson's Early Cumberland and Westmoreland Friends, and Backhouse's Life of Howgill, and is popularly known as The Quaker's Curse and Its Fulfillment. Francis Howgill, a noted member of the Society of Friends, resided at Todthorne, near Greyrig, in Westmoreland, about the middle of the 17th century. At one time, he traveled about the south of England preaching, and when he visited Bristol, in company with his compatriot John Cam, his preaching was made in the occasion of great rioting. In 1663, he returned to his own neighborhood, whither his reputation had apparently preceded him, for upon arriving at the marketplace of Kendal, he was summoned to appear before the justices, who were holding a court in a tavern. They tendered Howgill the oath of allegiance when he came before them, and as he refused to take it, they committed him to confinement in Appleby jail. It may be pointed out, as a matter of history, that in the earliest days of the Brotherhood, members of the Society of Friends were often subjected to severe penalties and much persecution for their refusal to conform to the taking of judicial oaths. At Appleby, the judges of assizes also tendered Howgill the same oath, and on his refusal to swear it, ordered him to be indicted at the next assizes. Meanwhile, they offered to release him from custody if he would give a bond for his good behavior in the interim. But this he refused to do, and therefore was recommitted to prison. During his imprisonment, a curious incident happened. Howgill was allowed by the magistrates to go home to Greyrig for a few days on private affairs, and in the course of the time he was at liberty, the Quaker felt himself compelled to visit a justice of the name of Ducat, residing at Greyrig Hall, who was a great persecutor of the Quakers, and was also one of the magistrates concerned in committing him to prison. Francis Howgill, on this occasion, was accompanied by a friend who, over the initials J.D., would appear to have written a report of the interview. Justice Ducat expressed much surprise at seeing Howgill, and said to him, "What is your wish now, Francis? I thought you had been in Appleby jail." Howgill replied to this effect, "No, I am not, but I am come with a message from the Lord. Thou hast persecuted the Lord's people, but his hand is now against thee, and he will send a blast upon all that thou hast, and thy name shall rot out of the earth, and this thy dwelling shall become desolate, and a habitation for owls and jackdaws." When Howgill had delivered this message, the justice trembled, and said, "Francis, are you in earnest?" To which Howgill responded, "Yes, I am in earnest. It is the word of the Lord to thee, and there are many now living who will see it." This prediction by the Quaker appears to have been remarkably fulfilled, For according to the testimony of James Wilson, who was a minister among the Friends, and who lived at one time at Grayrig Foot in Westmoreland, this Justice Ducat had several children, and all those children died without leaving any issue, whilst some of them came to poverty. James Wilson himself had repeatedly given alms at his door to a woman, the last of the Ducat family, who begged her bread from door to door. Grayrig Hall passed into the possession of the Lowther family, was dismantled, fell into ruins, and in 1777, little more than its extensive foundations were visible. After having long been the habitation of owls and jackdaws, the ruins were entirely removed, and a farmhouse erected upon the site of the old hall, and thus the Quaker's curse was fulfilled.
Section 36. Hereford. The Reverend Dr. Bretton, towards the close of his career appointed rector of Ludgate, early in life held a living in Hereford. He had married a daughter of Dr. Santer, a lady well known for her piety and virtue, but who died and left an infant to her husband's care. The child was entrusted to the charge of an old servant of Mrs. Bretton, who had since married, and who nursed it in her own cottage near the doctor's residence. The story, which has often been related in various collections and in different ways, according to the original account, states that one day when the woman was nursing the infant, the door of her cottage was opened, and a lady entered, so exactly resembling the late Mrs. Bretton in dress and appearance that she exclaimed, "If my mistress were not dead, I should think you were she." Whereupon the apparition told her she was so, and requested her to go with her, as she had business of importance to communicate. Alice objected, being very much frightened, and entreated her to address herself rather to Dr. Bretton. But Mrs. B. answered that she had endeavoured to do so, and had been several times in his room for that purpose, but he was still asleep, and she had no power to do more towards awakening him than once uncover his feet. Alice then pleaded that she had nobody to leave with her child, but Mrs. B. promising that the child should sleep till her return, she at length obeyed the summons, and having accompanied the apparition into a large field, the latter bade her observe how much she measured off with her feet, and having taken a considerable compass, she made her go and tell her brother that all that portion had been wrongfully taken from the poor by their father, and that he must restore it to them, adding that she was the more concerned about it since her name had been used in the transaction. Alice then asking how she should satisfy the gentleman of the truth of her mission, Mrs. B. mentioned to her some circumstances known only to herself and this brother. Then she entered into much discourse with the woman, and gave her a great deal of good advice, till hearing the sound of horse bells, she said, "Alice, I must be seen by none but yourself," and then disappeared. When the apparition had gone away, the servant proceeded to the residence of her master, and acquainted him with what had occurred. Dr. Bretton admitted that he had actually heard some one walking about in his room in a way that he could not account for, as no one was visible. He then mentioned the matter to his brother, who laughed heartily at it, until Alice communicated to him the secret which she was commissioned to reveal to him. Upon hearing it, he changed his tone, and declared himself ready to make the restitution required. Dr. Bretton, it may be remarked, never made any secret of the affair, but discussed it freely with many persons.
Section 39. Holland House. The History of Holland House, by the Princess Marie Liechtenstein, the adopted daughter of the present Lady Holland, is a well-known popular account of one of the most interesting London residences extant. The many highly gifted men and beautiful women who have frequented Holland House for several generations past have endowed it with memories of a most attractive nature. But the Princess Marie's work tells us that reminiscences of a far less pleasing character hover about the old house, and indeed that, like most respectable dwellings of any antiquity, Holland House is haunted. At least 2 ghostly legends, according to the fair authoress, are connected with it. An ancient manor house, belonging to Sir William Cope, it is believed, formerly stood where Holland House now stands, and, so it would seem, was incorporated in the present mansion. Sir William Cope's daughter and heiress Isabel was married to Sir Henry Rich, created Baron Kensington in 1622 and sent to Spain by James I to assist in negotiating a marriage between Prince Charles and the Infanta. In 1624 he was created Earl of Holland, and it was this same nobleman, as the princess tells us, who added to the buildings its wings and arcades, and more than this, he employed the best artists of the time in decorating the interior. Clarendon describes the Earl as a very handsome man, of a lovely and winning presence and gentle conversation. He played, says the historian, a conspicuous part during the reign of Charles I and the commencement of the struggle with the Parliament. After having stood in high favor with Queen Henrietta, he fell under a suspicion of disloyalty, which was confirmed by his lending Holland House for a meeting between Fairfax and certain discontented members of Parliament. The year following, having rejoined the Royalists, he was taken in arms at St. Neots, and, having been imprisoned at Warwick Castle, he was condemned to death and beheaded in March 1648 or 9 in Palace Yard. Warburton, in a note to Clarendon's history, says, "He lived like a knave and died like a fool. He appeared on the scaffold dressed in a white satin waistcoat and a white satin cap with silver lace. After some divine conference with a clergyman and an affectionate leave-taking with a friend, he turned to the executioner and said, 'Here, my friend, let my clothes and my body alone. There is 10 pounds for thee. That is better than my clothes, I am sure of it. And when you take up my head, do not take off my cap.' He appears, however, even by Warburton's account, to have died with much firmness, and his head was severed by one blow from his body." This Lord Holland, the first of his name and the chief builder of Holland House, is, the Princess Liechtenstein tells us, believed to yet haunt one room of the splendid old mansion. The gilt room is said to be tenanted by the solitary ghost of its first lord, who, according to tradition, issues forth at midnight from behind a secret door and walks slowly through the scenes of former triumphs with his head in his hand. To add to this mystery, there is a tale of 3 spots of blood on one side of the recess whence he issues. 3 spots which can never be effaced. In the grounds of Holland House is the Green Lane, formerly called Nightingale Lane, as long as nightingales frequented it. It is, says the princess, a long avenue, like an immense gallery arched with trees and carpeted with grass, the distant light at the end softening down into that misty blue so peculiar to dear England. This avenue is the scene of a spiritual experience chronicled by Aubrey in his Miscellanies, and which is as follows. The beautiful Lady Diana Rich, daughter to the Earl of Holland, as she was walking in her father's garden at Kensington, to take the air before dinner about 11 o'clock, being then very well, met her own apparition, habit and everything, as in a looking-glass, about a month after she died of smallpox. And 'tis said that her sister, the Lady Isabella Thynne, saw the like of herself also before she died. This account I had from a person of honor. A third sister, Mary, was married to the Earl of Breadalbane, we are informed, and it has been recorded that she also, not long after her marriage, had some such warning of her approaching dissolution. And so the old tradition has remained, and who would wish it removed? Belonging to past times, it should be respected. But whether we respect tradition or not, it is a received fact that whenever the mistress of Holland House meets herself, death is hovering about her.
Section 40. Lambden Castle. At Lambden Castle, in Durham, there is shown the figure of a man, in armour, cut in stone, having something like razors set in his back plate. He is represented in the act of thrusting his sword down the throat of a dragon or serpent. The tradition which is typified by this ancient figure, and which for centuries has been identified with the Lambden family, now represented by the Earl of Durham, is one of the most singular and notorious in England. Burke, in his Vicissitudes of Families, gives the tale at some length, but derives it chiefly from Surtees, the historian and antiquary, and from him, with some few additional particulars from other local authorities, we purpose giving it in a somewhat abridged form. According to the old legend, the Lambdens were so brave that they feared neither man nor God, and apparently had no respect for the Sabbath. One Sunday, therefore, the reckless heir of the race, according to his profane custom, went to fish in the river Wear, and after trying his piscatorial skill for a long time, without success, vented his disappointment in curses loud and deep, much to the distress of passers-by on their road to church. At length his luck appeared as if about to change, for he felt something struggling at the end of his line. Pulling it carefully to land, in expectation of capturing a great fish, he was woefully disappointed and enraged to find it was a worm or snake of repulsive appearance. He cleared it from his hook and flung it into an adjacent well, remarking to a passer-by that he thought he had caught the devil, and requesting his opinion on the strange animal. The stranger, after looking into the well, remarked that he had never seen anything like it before, that it was like an eft, but that it had 9 holes in each side of its mouth, and opined that it betokened no good. After a while, the heir of the Lambtons repented of his evil courses, and proceeded to a distant land, in order to wage war against the infidels. During the 7 long years that he was absent from home, a most distressing and unexpected state of affairs had come to pass. The worm or serpent which he had flung into the well on that desecrated Sabbath had grown so large that it had to seek another and more capacious place of residence. The locality which it selected as its favorite abode was a small hill near the village of Fatfield, on the north side of the River Wear, about 1.5 miles below Lambton Castle. And at last, so great was its length, and so great was its strength, that it could and would wind itself round this hill, which is upwards of 300 yards in circumference, to a triple cord, in such a manner that traces of its folds have remained almost to within memory of the last generation. It became a terror to the whole country, committing all kinds of devastation on the flocks and herds, and poisoning the pasture with its reeking breath. In vain did the knights and gentlemen thereabouts endeavour to slay this monster. It was a match for the best of them, always leaving them minus life or limb, for although many of them had succeeded in cutting it asunder, the severed parts had reunited immediately, and the worm remained whole as before the conflict. Finally the heir of Lambton returned from the wars. He was naturally distressed to learn of the desolation of his ancestral lands, and still more so when he discovered that the cause of all the misery was really due to the monster he had drawn to land on the long bygone desecrated Sabbath. He determined, at all risks, to endeavour to destroy the monster, but as all previous adventurers had failed, he deemed it best, before undertaking the conflict, to consult a witch or wise woman as to the best method of proceeding. Accordingly, he applied to a witch, and, after having been reproached as the cause of all the misery brought upon the country, she advised him how to act. He was directed to provide himself with a coat of armour covered with razors, and, by means of that and his trusty sword, promised success, that is to say, conditionally upon his making a solemn vow to kill the first living thing which he should meet after slaying the worm. Lambton agreed to the conditions, but was informed that if he failed to keep his word, the lords of Lambton for 9 generations should not die in their beds. No very great hardship, it might be deemed, for that martial age. According to his instructions, the knight had a suit of armour covered with razors made, and having donned this, he instructed his aged father that when he had destroyed the worm, he would blow 3 blasts upon his horn as a signal of his victory. Thereupon his favourite greyhound was to be let loose, so that it might run to him, and therefore be the first thing that would meet him, and thus be slain in fulfilment of his agreement with the witch. The father promised and gave his blessing, and young Lambton, having made the vow and joined, started on his dangerous expedition. As soon as he approached the hill on which the worm was coiled, it unwound itself and came down to the riverside to attack him. Nothing daunted by its hideous aspect, the knight struck at it with might and main, yet without appearing to make any impression upon it beyond increasing its rage. It now seized its opponent in its horrid folds, and sought to strangle him, but the more tightly it grasped him, the more frightfully was it wounded, the razor blades cutting it through and through. But as often as the monster fell to the ground, cut by the knight's terrible coat of mail, as often, says the legend, did the severed pieces reunite, and the wounds heal up. Lambden, seeing that the worm was not to be destroyed in this way, stepped into the river whither the monster followed him. The change of position proved fatal to the worm, for as fast as the pieces were cut off by the razors, they were carried away by the stream, and the monster, being unable to reunite itself, was, after the desperate conflict, at last utterly destroyed. As soon as Lambden had achieved the victory, he blew 3 blasts upon his horn, but his father, in the excitement of the moment, forgot to have the greyhound unloosened, and in his impatience ran out of the castle to greet his son, and was the first living being that met his gaze. The knight embraced his father, and again blew his horn, upon which the hound was let loose, and running towards Lambden was slain. But this was too late to retrieve matters, his vow having enjoined the slaying of the first living creature that he should meet with, and his father had been the first to meet him. So the curse was on the house of Lambden, and for 9 generations not one of its lords would die in his bed. Sir Bernard Burke points out that popular tradition traces the curse back to Robert Lambden, who died without issue in 1442, leaving the estates to his brother Thomas, but bequeathing by his will to his brother John Lambden, Knight of Rhodes, 100 marks. In an ancient pedigree, this John Lambden, Knight of Rhodes, is described as he that slew the worm, and as Lord of Lambden after the death of 4 brothers without male issue. His son Robert is said to have been drowned at Newbrig, near the chapel where the knight had registered his rash and unperformed vow, and tradition specifies a bedless death for each successive 9 generations of the Lords of Lambden. After advertising to the various ways and places in which different heirs of Lambden met with death, our chief authority for this portion of the legend concludes: great curiosity prevailed in the lifetime of Henry to know if the curse could hold good to the end. He died in his chariot, crossing the New Bridge in 1761, thus giving the last connecting link to the chain of circumstantial evidence connected with the history of the Worm of Lambden. His succeeding brother, General Lambden, who lived to a great age, fearing that the prophecy might be possibly fulfilled by his servants, under the idea that he could not die in his bed, kept a horsewhip beside him in his last illness, and thus eluded the prediction. Although the spell put on this ancient family by the witch is said to have been broken by the death of Henry Lambden in 1761, yet neither of the 2 last lords have died at home, and this, to the knights of ancient times, says Burke, would have been sorer punishment than dying in the battlefield, for they loved to sleep in their own country, and with their fathers.
Section 42. London, Argyle Rooms. In the well-known diary of Thomas Raikes, and under date of December 26, 1832, is recounted a very singular account of an apparition which appeared to a young lady at the Argyle Rooms, a highly fashionable establishment in those days, and, need it be stated, then noted for a class of entertainment very different from that it afterwards became known for. Mr. Raikes, who had the anecdote from a member of the lady's family chiefly concerned, tells the story in these words. It is now about 15 months ago that Miss M., a connection of my family, went with a party of friends to a concert at the Argyle Rooms. She appeared there to be suddenly seized with indisposition, and though she persisted for some time to struggle against what seemed a violent, nervous affection, it became at last so oppressive that they were obliged to send for their carriage and conduct her home. She was for a long time unwilling to say what was the cause of her indisposition, but on being more earnestly questioned, she at length confessed that she had, immediately on arriving in the concert room, been terrified by a horrible vision which unceasingly presented itself to her sight. It seemed to her as though a naked corpse was lying on the floor at her feet. The features of the face were partly covered by a cloth mantle, but enough was apparent to convince her that the body was that of Sir J.Y. Every effort was made by her friends at the time to tranquillize her mind by representing the folly of allowing such delusions to prey upon her spirits, and she thus retired to bed. But on the following day, the family received the tidings of Sir J.Y. having been drowned in Southampton River that very night by the oversetting of his boat, and the body was afterwards found entangled in a boat cloak. Here, remarks Raikes, is an authenticated case of second sight, and of very recent date. End of section 42. Section 43. London, Broad Street. One of those stories of apparitions which are so frequently alluded to, but of which the facts are apparently, chiefly or entirely unknown to most authors of supernatural works, is that related by the Reverend Dr. Scott, an eminent divine in his days. The narrative of this most marvellous affair originally appeared in the History and Reality of Apparitions, from which curious little work we shall transcribe it. The editor of that book, which was published in 1770, and who was apparently Defoe, asserts that this story had never appeared in print before, and adds of the Reverend Dr. Scott that he was not only a man whose learning and piety were eminent, but one whose judgment was known to be good, and who could not easily be imposed upon. According to the story, Dr. Scott was sitting alone by his fireside in the library of his house in Broad Street. He had shut himself in the room to study, and, so it is alleged, had locked the door. In the midst of his reading, happening to look up, he was much astounded to see, sitting in an elbow chair on the other side of the fireplace, a grave elderly gentleman in a black velvet gown and a long wig, looking at him with a pleased countenance, and as if about to speak. Knowing that he had locked the door, Dr. Scott was quite confounded at seeing this uninvited visitor sitting in the elbow chair, and from the first appears to have suspected its supernatural character. Indeed, so disturbed was he at the sight of the apparition, for such it was, that he was unable to speak, as he himself acknowledged in telling the story. The spectre, however, began the discourse by telling the doctor not to be frightened, for it would do him no harm, but came to see him upon a matter of great importance to an injured family which was in danger of being ruined. Although the doctor was a stranger to this family, the apparition stated that, knowing him to be a man of integrity, it had selected him to perform an act of great charity as well as justice. At first, Dr. Scott was not sufficiently composed to pay proper attention to what the apparition propounded, but was rather more inclined to escape from the room if he could, and made one or two futile attempts to knock for some of his household to come up, at which his visitor appeared to be somewhat displeased. But, as the doctor afterwards stated, he had no power to go out of the room even if he had been next the door, nor to knock for help, even if any had been close at hand. Then the apparition, seeing the doctor still so confused, again desired him to compose himself, assuring him that he would not do him the slightest injury, nor do anything to cause him the least uneasiness, but desired that he would permit him to deliver the business he came about, which when he had heard, he said, he would probably see less cause to be surprised or apprehensive than he did now. By this time Dr. Scott had somewhat recovered himself, and, encouraged by the calm manner in which the apparition addressed him, contrived to falter out, "In the name of God, what art thou?" "I desire you will not be frightened," responded the apparition. "I am a stranger to you, and if I tell you my name you will not know it. But you may do the business without inquiring further." The doctor could not compose himself, but still remained very uneasy, and for some time said nothing. Again the apparition attempted to reassure him, but could only elicit from him a repetition of the ejaculation, "In the name of God, what art thou?" Upon this, says the narration, the spectre appeared to be displeased, and expostulated with Dr. Scott, telling him that it could have terrified him into compliance, but that it chose to come quietly and calmly to him, and indeed made use of such civil and natural discourse that the doctor began to grow a little more familiar, and at last ventured to ask what it wanted of him. Upon this the apparition appeared to be very gratified, and began its story. It related that it had once owned a very good estate, which at that time was enjoyed by its grandson. Two nephews, however, the sons of its younger brother, were then suing for possession of the property, and owing to certain family reasons which the doctor could not or would not specify, were likely to oust the young man from his property. A deed of settlement, being the conveyance of the inheritance, could not be found, and without it the owner of the estate had every reason to fear he would be ejected. "Well," said Dr. Scott, "what can I do in the case?" "Go to my grandson," said the apparition, "and direct him where to find the missing deed, which is concealed in a place where I put it myself." And then it gave the doctor minute particulars of the chest wherein the needed document was hidden, stowed away in an old lumber room. When the apparition had impressed the matter thoroughly upon the doctor's mind, Dr. Scott not unnaturally asked his visitor why he could not direct the grandson himself to recover the missing deed. "Ask me not about that," said the apparition. "There are divers reasons which you may know hereafter. I can depend upon your honesty in it in the meantime." Still Dr. Scott did not like to take upon himself the strange mission, whereupon the apparition seemed to grow angry, and even begin to threaten him, so that he was at last compelled to promise compliance. The apparition then assumed a pleasant aspect, thanked him, and disappeared. The strangest part of this strange story yet remains to be told. At the earliest opportunity, Dr. Scott posted away to the address given him by the apparition, or dream, as some persons deemed it. He asked for, and was at once introduced to the gentleman the apparition had sent him to, and to his surprise was received most cordially by him. Dr. Scott's surprise was indeed quickened when the stranger entered most unreservedly into the particulars of his lawsuit, telling him that he had had a dream the previous night, in which he had dreamed that a strange gentleman came to him and assisted him to find the deed which was needed to confirm him in the possession of his estate. This assured Dr. Scott that it was not a dream which he had had, and that he was really selected to discover the missing document. Making himself agreeable to his host, he eventually got him to take him all over his splendid old mansion. Finally he beheld just such a lumber room as the apparition had told him of, and on entering it saw an exact facsimile of the chest described to him by his supernatural visitant. There was an old rusty key in it that would neither turn round nor come out of the lock, which was exactly what the apparition had forewarned him of. At the doctor's request a hammer and chisel were sent for, and the chest broken open, and after some difficulty a false drawer was found in it. This being split open, there lay the missing parchment, spread out flat over the whole breadth of the bottom of the trunk. The joy of the young heir and of his family may be imagined, whilst their surprise can have been no less. Whether Dr. Scott informed them of the means by which he was led to make the discovery is not stated, but it is alleged the production of the needed deed confirmed the owner in the possession of his estates. As this gentleman was still living, the narrator was not inclined to publish his name, and nowadays the chances of discovering it are, doubtless, far less than they were in his time of finding the missing document. Regard it how we may, as a dream or a coincidence, certainly Dr. Scott's adventure was a very marvellous one. End of section 43.
Section 44. London, James Street, W.C. In his Miscellanies, Aubrey records in his very concise manner the account of an apparition that appeared to a lady who lodged in James Street, Covent Garden. This lady was beloved by Lord Mohun's son and heir, a gallant gentleman, valiant, and a great master of fencing and horsemanship. But, although she was very handsome, she was of lowlier lineage than her lover. Mr. Mohun, on account of some reason not stated, had a quarrel with Prince Griffin, and a challenge resulting therefrom, agreed to meet his antagonist in the morning at Chelsea Fields, and there fight him on horseback. In the morning Mr. Mohun started off to keep his appointment, but by Ebury Farm he was met by some people who quarrelled with and shot him. These folk were supposed to have been acting under Prince Griffin's orders, as Mr. Mohun, being so much the better horseman, was, it is suggested, certain to have proved victorious had he met his opponent in the manner agreed upon. Mr. Mohun was murdered about 10 o'clock in the morning, and at the identical time of his death, his mistress, being in bed at her lodgings in James Street, saw her lover come to her bedside, draw the curtains, look upon her, and then go away. She called after him, but received no answer. She then knocked for her maid, and inquired for Mr. Mohun. But the maid said she had not seen him, and he could not have been in the room, as she had the key of it in her pocket. This account the narrator had direct from the mouths of the lady and her maid.
Section 45. London, St. James's Palace. In a small collection of more or less known accounts of apparitions, edited by T.M. Jarvis and published in 1823 under the title of Accredited Ghost Stories, is one which describes the appearance of the Duchess of Mazarin after her death to Madame de Beauclerc. The name of the authority for this story is not given, but Mr. Jarvis declares that he solemnly protested his conviction of the truth of it, and that several other persons of undoubted credit, alive when the narrative was published, were also satisfied as to its being a relation of fact. The Duchess of Mazarin, need it be premised, was mistress to Charles II, whilst Madame de Beauclerc held a similar position towards his brother and successor, James II. These two women are said to have been greatly attached to each other, a somewhat singular circumstance when their positions are taken into consideration. After the burning of Whitehall, these favourites of royalty were removed to St. James's Palace, where they were allotted very handsome suites of apartments, but, says our author, the face of public affairs being then wholly changed, and a new set of courtiers as well as rules of behaviour come into vogue, they conversed almost wholly with each other. The truth would appear to be that these women, being neglected on account of new favourites, had a fellow feeling for each other, and, as is not unusual in such cases, began to discuss matters of a graver nature than had been their custom hitherto. In one of the more serious consultations which these ci-devant favourites held together on the immortality of the soul, they discussed the doctrine of apparitions, and made a solemn stipulation that whichever one died first, she would return, if there was a possibility of so doing, and give the other an account of what position she was in the next life. This promise, says the account, was often repeated, and the Duchess happening to fall sick, and her life despaired of by all about her, Madame de Beauclerc reminded her of her solemn promise, to which her Grace responded that she might depend upon her performance of it. These words passed between them not above an hour before the dissolution of the Duchess, and were spoken before several persons who were in the room, although they did not comprehend the meaning of what they heard. Some years after the Duchess's decease happening, says our author, in a visit I made to Madame de Beauclerc, to fall upon the topic of futurity, she expressed her disbelief of it with a great deal of warmth, which a little surprising me, as being of a quite contrary way of thinking myself, and had always, by the religion she professed, supposed her highly so. In answer to her interlocutor's arguments, the lady related her compact with her departed friend, and, in spite of all he could urge, deemed the non-appearance of her friend's apparition was a proof of the non-existence of a future state. Some months after this conversation, its narrator states that he was visiting at an acquaintance of Madame de Beauclerc. We were just set down to cards about 9 o'clock in the evening, as near as I can remember, is his record, when a servant came hastily into the room and acquainted the lady I was with that Madame de Beauclerc had sent to entreat she would come that moment to her, adding that if she desired ever to see her more in this world, she must not delay her visit. The lady, having a severe cold, and hearing that Madame de Beauclerc was apparently in good health, declined to accede to this request, but on receiving a second, still more urgent message, accompanied by a bequest of a casket containing the watch, chain, necklace, and other trinkets of Madame de Beauclerc, hastened to that lady's apartments, accompanied by our narrator. On arrival at Madame's, he sent up his name and was requested to come up with his companion at once. Upon entering the room where Madame de Beauclerc was, she informed him, after a few introductory words, that she would very soon pass from this world into that eternity which she once doubted, but was now assured of. She then proceeded to declare that she had seen the Duchess of Mazarin. "I perceived not how she entered," was her statement, "but turning my eyes towards yonder corner of the room, I saw her stand in the same form and habit she was accustomed to appear in when living. Fain would I have spoken, but had not the power of utterance. She took a little circuit round the chamber, seeming rather to swim than walk, then stopped by the side of that Indian chest, and looking on me with her usual sweetness, said, 'Beauclerc, between the hours of 12 and 1 this night, you will be with me.' The surprise I was in at first being a little abated, I began to ask some questions concerning that future world I was so soon to visit, but on the opening of my lips for that purpose, she vanished from my sight. It was now nearly 12, and Madame de Beauclerc not appearing to be suffering from any ailment, they endeavored to revive her spirits. But, says the narrator, we scarce began to speak, when suddenly her countenance changed, and she cried out, 'Oh, I am sick at heart!' Mrs. Wood applied some restoratives, but to no effect. She grew still worse, and in about half an hour expired, it being exactly the time the apparition had foretold. End of section 45.